I suspect that many of you are here because you came across a little book that you finished on a flight and then just kept on reading. Jim Carse's Finite and Infinite Games is one of those books that gets on people's lists of books that changed how they think about everything. And Kevin Kelly tracked James P. Carse down. He's retired from NYU, and it's a great privilege and honor to have him here to speak tonight. Jim Carse.
One of the pleasures about being here is finally meeting Stewart, which was only an hour ago or so. Not only was I a fan of the catalog, but Stewart wrote, I don't even know if he remembers this, he wrote a review of the book in question that is one of my favorite reviews. And it goes simply like this. It was, I believe it was written in the catalog. He said, a number of people have been recommending this book to me. I've read it, and I'm not yet sure it's not horse exhaust. And the only review I like better, really, is one in the New York Times. The reviewer took 10 or 12 precious inches in the Sunday Book Review to say I should never have been born. You know, it's always a little intimidating for me as an academic to be in the context or be in the presence of people in a situation like this who actually do and make things. You know, it's like truly being in the real world. When I think about myself that way, I realize that I went to school, I guess I was 4, maybe 5 years old into kindergarten, and never left. I've never really been truly gainfully employed. You know, I've been reading books and talking to people about them my entire life, or as people in the academy like to refer to it, the leisure of the theory class. I have one of my colleagues said to me one day a couple of years ago. He said, "Carse, thank God it's Wednesday." As Stewart mentioned, I did retire, but I can't remember when. I'm sure, I'm sure there's a date, but nothing happened. You know, I felt like I was already retired. I've always been retired. But another thing about being in a group like this is that it's very different from an academic audience because academics don't come to hear what you know, they come to hear what you don't know. And it's very competitive, and it has a wholly different kind of spirit. And I feel considerably challenged by the fact that you are undoubtedly here truly to learn something, and I hope I can respond to that successfully. What I would like to do tonight is reflect, really. This is more reflection and rumination than it is a genuine lecture on a very interesting and complicated issue, and that is the relationship of religion and war. It's complicated because almost inevitably, any kind of war anywhere becomes identified with or somehow involves the phenomenon of religion. And we often feel that war has, in fact, been, or religion has been the cause of war. And yet at the same time, there is something in the nature of religion that's really anti-war. So how do we straighten out all these ideas? I have a thesis I'd like to try on you. Also, I have an idea that I've never really discussed in public before, but I've been working on it for a while. As a matter of fact, I mentioned a couple of people before the lecture. I've been working on a book I call Higher Ignorance, subtitled The Religious Case Against Belief. What I'd like to argue tonight, I'd like to develop an understanding and see how you respond to it, that makes a distinction between religion and belief. To be religious and to be a believer are really two different things. Now, I know it sounds odd, and it's a difficult case to make, and I may not make it very well, but I'm going to try it in a moment. The thesis that I want to discuss is simple to state, very complicated and difficult to elucidate and defend. And that is, war is the ultimate finite game, religion the ultimate infinite game. Now, by the way, in these remarks, I will use a lot of big statements, a lot of generalizations, and I'll leave the nuances out for two reasons. It's too much time, and also I want to stimulate as much thinking as I can in you and develop. I hope you feel free to ask a number of questions. I think it's important to give a little kind of conceptual background to what I'm about to say. I know a lot of you have read the book, the games book, and I'm sorry if I go over some material you're very familiar with, and some of you, many of you have not, and this may be too brief for you not to be absolutely recondite, but I'll give it a shot. The simplest possible definition of finite and infinite games is that a finite game is a game you play to win, and an infinite game, one you play to continue the play, to keep the play going. An infinite player has the talent of seeing when someone is about to lose and is able, when he or she does see that, either to change the rules or otherwise find a way of getting that person back into the play. So that you can think of a finite game or of an infinite game, having a lot of finite characteristics, of course, surrounded by people who may or may not be involved in the game, or who may be and find themselves losing out and so on. And therefore having the freedom of changing the rules, changing the structure of the game to keep everyone in play, as opposed to a finite game, which has very definite and unchangeable rules. And the reason that rules are unchangeable is that there's no way of knowing who's won if the rules are changed. If the Lakers come out in the second half when they're already 20 points behind and realize they've got to do something dramatic to win, and they decide to come out with 2 balls, they might win the game, but as a matter of fact, they won't convince anyone else. They have to play within those boundaries, definitely. Now, the notion of a boundary is very important in a finite game, and it's very complicated. It has a lot of nuances to it. Boundaries can be of several kinds. You have to know when a game is coming to an end, or how it comes to an end. You have to agree on that. If it doesn't come to an end, you really haven't played the game. I'm talking about finite games now. But the boundaries can be of several kinds. They can be temporal boundaries, they can be spatial boundaries, they can be numerical boundaries, and they can even be psychological boundaries, of course. But everyone has to understand where the boundary is and exactly how to play and how they are within that boundary, where they're related to the boundary. Now an infinite player, instead of an infinite player, instead of living within boundaries, lives within what I'd like to call a horizon. Now, a horizon is very different from a boundary. You can't tell exactly where the line of a horizon is. If I asked you to draw the line somewhere that indicates the end of your vision, it's something you cannot see from the center of your vision. You just see where your vision ends up. And if you go to that place and indicate the line, of course, now the line is somewhere else. So therefore, a horizontal experience is one in which you shift, you move, and your vision changes. New things come into view. And as a result, you are in a different place than you were previously. I remember, I'll give you a very simple example. When I went to college, I'd grown up in a sort of a typical Midwestern family. In my first semester at college, I took an introductory course in sociology. It was the first time, believe it or not, I ever heard the word middle class. And I thought, middle class, it's a strange term. And then when I began to realize that I had grown up in a middle class family and culture, suddenly I had a very different picture of what that culture was, who I am, what my life has been about, and so on. A very simple way of moving the line of the end of my vision to something else. Normally, we would hope that anyone in an educational process, whether it's in school or in their life, indefinitely extends their vision, that they live, as I would like to call it, horizontally. Now, another element important to a finite play is what I call veiling. You have to, when you're in a finite game, you have to take the game very seriously. There are lots of examples of this. Sports, of course, and any athletic event is a pretty good example. While you're playing, you've got to commit yourself somehow to the idea of winning. You've got to be totally dedicated to it. You've got to have nothing else on your mind. It has to be essentially life or death. But in fact, of course, it's not. It is we put ourselves into that frame of mind freely. We choose to veil ourselves. Now this, for me, is an extremely important point. Because what that means is that if we veil ourselves to enter into a finite game, it is something we're actually doing freely, and in a certain sense also consciously. We're aware of it, even if we're not aware that we're aware. At some level, someplace in us, we know what we're doing. What that means is that any game we play freely. What that means is that even games that are very, very difficult, with high stakes, even warfare, is something we do freely. Or to put it the other way around, it's something we can choose not to do. I remember Jean-Paul Sartre and how shocked I was in a section of his book, Being and Nothingness, when he talked about, he made this point about warfare, saying that even, and of course now, at this point, he had the Nazis in mind, the German invasion of France in mind. Even when the army brings the war to your village, and it's an overwhelming force, you still have the freedom not to fight it. You may pay with your life, but you cannot excuse yourself from the freedom of choice to do that. Therefore, we say, or sometimes I use this phrase, whoever must play cannot play. True play is always taken up with a spontaneous desire to do the play. I'm often asked naturally for examples of infinite play. And there are many, of course, but one of my favorites is when I was a kid, I was living in as I said, in a middle-class neighborhood, and at this point in a suburb of Chicago. It was during the Second World War. There was, across the street from our house, an open lot, a double lot. It was quite large for that area. It had never been built on. And as far as I know, nobody owned it. It was just there, and kids played on it. What we played on it was this. We played basically a softball game. But the way it happened is that you'd get up in the morning. I lived right across the street from this space. There would be someone out there already playing. Or you'd go out yourself, maybe, and just throw the ball around, throw it up in the air and catch it. And eventually someone would come out. We would play all day long and sometimes keep score, sometimes not. It was almost an endless game. But then something very peculiar began to happen. That was a summer when all this began. Then school started that fall. It turned out that, we all knew this, but we didn't anticipate these consequences. There was a Catholic school 2 or 3 blocks away from this lot. Now, the Catholic kids got out later than the rest of us, the non-Catholics. And they also had a different experience in their school. So when they came down alongside, they came down the street where we were playing our softball game, they were full of all this, I don't know, anger or frustration or something. You know, I think if you're Catholic, you probably understand. And they immediately and aggressively got into the play of this game, and you know, essentially destroyed it. But there was one kid in the group, a little guy named John Fellingham. I have no idea whatever happened to John, who had a rare gift. His gift was that he had a way of talking to these Catholic kids, giving them poetic names: Speed, Ace, Champ, Slugger, Tiger, and the kids were charmed by these names, and they took their place in the game with that name, with that identity, and the games went on. Now, I have to admit, though, that these Catholics are pretty scary people. It didn't always work for me that the game kept going, and it was, I guess it was somewhere in my early adulthood, I realized that the image of these kids coming down the street after school had fixed itself in my mind so deeply that I actually believed, and you know, I think I still do, that I can tell a Catholic on the street. I see someone walking along and there's a Catholic, I'm sure the guy's a Catholic. And it's one of my really deep prejudices. I just haven't been able to lose it. But the point I want to make is that little John Fellingham, who was a little squeak of a guy, was really otherwise had nothing to commend himself, had the gift of poetry. He was able to create a linguistic, playful atmosphere that allowed these kids to play in our game and allowed us to have them in the game. And naturally, it changed their lives and our lives at the same time. Modestly, mind you, but at least it was a significant change, and I remember it very well. It stands out as one of the more interesting experiences of that kind in my childhood. I just want to make one more point before I go into some other reflections here, and that is something I don't stress enough in the book, I think. And that is, now I don't have Catholics in mind here, but there is something we have to call genuine evil. Evil, if I use the terms of the game language, would be an infinite game that becomes absorbed utterly in a finite game, where infinite play is ended for good. It's not always the case. No matter how excellent our poetry is, that we can include the outsider, the opponent, within our play. It very often is not the case. I want to stress that because when I talk about war, I have a very strong anti-war bias. But on the other hand, I understand, and I would emphasize the fact, that very frequently issues of genuine evil are involved in warfare. And I'll come back to that point a little later. I want to come back to the issue of poetry, too. Now, I want to make, I just have 4 categories here of discussion. Sort of 4 topics. Let me go through those, I'll tell you what they are, and then I'll reflect on each one of them. Why would I make the distinction between belief and religion? If religion and belief are distinct from one another, what then is religion and what is belief? That's the first topic. Second topic is how do we look at warfare in these categories? What can we say briefly about the nature of warfare that maybe illuminate our discussion? The third category is how are belief and warfare related to each other? And the fourth, how are religion and warfare related to each other, assuming they're different? Let me look first then at the difference between belief and religion. When we talk about belief, whether it's religious or any other kind of belief, the first thing we're likely to wonder is what, in fact, the person believes, what someone's beliefs are. A question rarely asked is, what is the nature of belief itself? Of course, by belief now, I mean really deep, what we call true belief. The kind of beliefs, it's not like, I believe I left my car in a no parking zone, or I believe that marriage is not going to work out, or the whole thousands of kinds of beliefs that in the classical tradition are sometimes referred to, classical philosophical tradition, as opinions. I mean really true beliefs, the kind that you would die for or risk your life for. What in fact is a belief like that? Or what is the nature of a belief like that? There are several characteristics that I want to emphasize. One is that a belief understood that way is the point where your thinking ends. It's a boundary situation. You come right up to a certain point and you stop with this kind of certainty and don't dare to go beyond that. Religion has had a lot of this in it. I mean, for example, in Christianity, the creeds, the early creeds, were intended to distinguish genuine believers from non-believers. The point was, if you could say the creed honestly, then you were a Christian. If you could not say it honestly, you were outside. You were not a Christian. Therefore, if you were a Christian, your thinking has to end where the creed ends. Now, naturally, on the other side of that, thinking can become very active. You can think a lot about what the meaning of the elements of the creed are, let's say. You can argue with each other and have a vivid discussion about it, but still, it's a bounded activity. It's something that occurs strictly within limits. So there's a limit. One of the limits is where our thinking ends. There's another kind of limit, and this is a little bit more difficult to discuss. I'm not sure I can make it absolutely clear. It's what I would call a temporal limit. Once we are totally convinced once we have a very strong and clear belief, we also assume that there will be nothing happening afterwards to change the nature of that belief. So that, in effect, what's happened is that for us, the true believer, history has ended. We've reached the end of significant history. Things will happen, but we will always understand them in present terms. This it's interesting to look at this in light of the foundation, because in a way what a true believer believes is not in a long now, but in a right now that stays forever. And so that the now moves with them, and nothing significant happens in history afterwards to change the nature of that belief. This is a very big tradition in Western philosophy. I suppose Hegel's the best example. Hegel thought there was, I'd love to talk about this, but Hegel's one of my favorites. Here's what Hegel said. Hegel thought there was a contradiction within the nature of thought itself that created the desire in the thinker to resolve the contradiction. It was a contradiction we couldn't stand having. Now, I'll give you a simple example. In his extraordinary book, The Phenomenology of the Spirit, he writes in the beginning. It was a very complicated, difficult book to read, but one of the parts I understand is the discussion of the master-servant relationship. What he points out is that while the master is superior to the servant, in fact, understands more about the master than the master does about the servant. The servant has a certain intellectual superiority to the master. This idea, and will actually eventually undo the master, that is, the higher level of understanding will, in the end, be superior, will triumph. That very point was what excited Karl Marx when he was reading Hegel. He interpreted it not in terms of the spirit, but in terms of matter, in terms of property, in terms of in physical terms. That is, the servant will eventually overthrow the master, not intellectually, but in terms of property, and take over ownership of what the master now owns. Now, what's at stake in that is a contradiction in the way these people are related that requires a kind of resolution. What what fails in Hegel, in my opinion, and not only my opinion, is that this process comes to an end. Hegel is the first and the greatest of what we call end-of-history thinkers. Eventually, this contradiction will resolve itself, and the mind, pure mind, will no longer be in contradiction to itself, but absolutely identified with itself. And who is this mind? Well, of course, it's God, the ultimate infinite mind. So that from Hegel's point of view, God in relation to the earth is God externalizing himself in such a way and creating contradictions that require God himself to eliminate the differences between himself and the other, and for all things to become, in the end, one. History ends, time ends, process ends in that respect. Now, of course, Hegel, there were some odd things in Hegel's life. For example, he thought for a while one of the kings of Germany, I think it was Frederick II, was pretty close to the end of history itself. And the other thing is, of course, that Hegel thought that he himself, his own thinking, was proof of the culmination of history in this set of ideas. In other words, extremely arrogant, and one has to say in the end, ignorant attitude. One of the consequences of Hegel's thinking is that he really set up the boundaries firmly. There is no history outside this. Everything now is intelligible. We understand everything. That's why in Marxism, this is where we know this way of thinking the best, if you don't agree with us, it's not that there's an intellectual issue, there is in fact an existential issue. You are criminal. You are in violation of the very basic essence of what it means to be human, and you have to be eliminated. End of history thinking is extremely important in recent world history, and it can be at times extremely, as we know, vicious. So what is belief? Belief involves the end of thinking, the true belief in the way in which I stated it. You understand now, again, I'm making these great big radical statements. It also means the end of history in the way in which I talked about it. Belief requires something else. If you think about the way people discuss and present their beliefs, you will notice that they always have in mind the non-believer. People don't state their beliefs unless they're stating them to or in the interest of the non-believer. You don't state your beliefs if everyone already agrees with them. You state them really to create a distinction between yourself and the other. One of the consequences of this is that the believer can't believe without a non-believer. And therefore, part of the process of believing is to create an opponent. Theists absolutely depend on atheists. One of the great points I think Nietzsche made, one of the reasons Nietzsche I think is if I had more time, I would no doubt be quoting Nietzsche even more, but when Nietzsche talked about the death of God, what he was talking about, in fact, was that it wasn't an atheism, it was a way of eliminating the object, the opponent to believers, in such a way that belief no longer had any meaning. So the death of God for him was the death of true belief. The importance of an opponent this is something we could reflect on a great deal. I'll leave it there. I'm going to come back to the point a little bit later. One last thing I want to say about belief is the importance of certainty to belief. and true believers usually have some kind of textual basis for it. In Marxism, as a simple example, of course, it was Marx's theory himself, the Declaration, the simple communist philosophy. In religion, it's very often a sacred text. What's important here is not just the existence of the text, but the way the text is used. The text is referred to as the end of our discussion. It is understood as providing truth, as being the basis for certainty. The Bible, for example, for true believers of this kind, answers every question. It is itself the source of all truth. Now this, sometimes it gets silly, I think. I mean, it's hard not to avoid examples like this, but the book that was being sold in the bookstore of the Grand Canyon, I don't know if you remember that little incident that took issue with the theory of evolution and made the point, it was a very popular book, by the way, sold a lot of copies in the bookstore, made the point that the Grand Canyon was created by Noah's flood. As it emptied out, it created the canyon, and they felt there was a lot of proof for this and so on. That's a way of using a biblical text as a kind of template for understanding everything else. Or it doesn't have to be biblical. It could be a lot of other kinds of philosophical or political agendas and declarations. That's belief. Now, what about religion if it's different from belief? This is the original idea, at least original for me, that I wanted to present to you, and I'd love to know how you respond to it. I was trying to think, it was not in respect to this talk, it was before we got to this. I was trying to think of good examples of really significant infinite play. And it struck me, and I was kind of surprised at how I hadn't seen this before, that the longest, most durable, identifiable traditions are the religions. Judaism has been with us as Judaism for 2,500 years. Hinduism has been with us as Hinduism for even longer. Buddhism for 2,600 years, and so on. Christianity and Islam, and I in other words, longevity is a really significant element in the understanding of religion. Now, where this gets complicated is that I'm not saying that infinite play is religion. What I'm really saying is that religion, the great religions, somehow have learned how to continue their existence, often at very great challenge, very great risk to themselves, with all kinds of Catholics pouring in from both sides. They've learned how to keep these traditions going, and they're still full of life, in spite of all these challenges. So what is it in them that will tell us something about the nature of infinite play? What we have to remember, too, of course, is that a lot of religions haven't endured. That, as a matter of fact, scores of them have long since disappeared. Egyptian religions, Sumerian, Mayan, Navajo, actually Navajo survives a little bit, but only in fragments, and so on. Just many, many religions around the world have long since disappeared. So what is it about the ones that continue that can illustrate for us, or are examples for us, of genuine infinite play? Well, for one thing, and here's something I think a lot of religious people might have trouble with. These religions are never identified with an ethnic group, with a certain belief system, with a geographical area, with a political ideology, with a given culture, with a given society. They are non-identified with the context in which they exist, while at the same time able to use elements in that context to make themselves richer. But they are never, so for example, when Rome ended, the Roman religions ended. When a certain culture wears out, the religions that have identified with those wear out. Interesting example for me is Mormonism. The Mormons have taken off extraordinarily rapidly. The only religion that's grown initially faster and larger than Mormonism in my knowledge of religious history is Islam, and maybe I'll mention that a little bit later. What's curious about the Mormons, though, is that they very carefully, they seem to identify very much with American culture. There doesn't seem to be much yet about Mormonism that is genuinely Mormon. There aren't Mormon philosophers or Mormon art or music that stands out in a way that we all would recognize. But at the same time, they have a kind of religious fervor that we have to keep an eye on. Maybe this is, we're watching right in front of our eyes the growth of the appearance of another religion. I don't know, it's an open question for me. So non-identity. Now, non-identity has a consequence to it. If a religion is not identified with its place, its history, its time, its people, its culture, and so on, what then is it? What is its identity? What I find most compelling about this way of thinking is that we can't say. There is something about a living religion that we cannot finally define. It continues, we all try to define it. Christians are always trying to say what Christianity is really about. Jews, the big discussion in Judaism is who is really a Jew, and so on. These questions can't be answered. As soon as we get close to an identity, we realize that we missed it. There's something almost, I guess the metaphor I want here is something like something explosive. There is something at the center of these religions that creates our thinking, that compels us to ask the question, what's going on here, but without providing us any basis for the answer. It's like a little bit like, in my thinking, it's like a black hole in reverse. It's some powerful thing that keeps sending out all this provocation and never allowing the people provoked to settle the issues. Who is a Jew? Who's really a Christian? What is Christianity about? What is Jesus really teaching? And so on. These questions are not answerable. There is not only, in other words, not only does a religion not identify with something, it doesn't have a definable identity. Religion is also, in this sense, the religions I'm talking about are profoundly horizontal. That is, they're interested in vision, in enlightenment, in awareness, awakening, in sort of extended knowledge, self-knowledge, lucidity, a new kind of seeing. Seeing is very important to this way of thinking about religion. And seeing is always horizontal. The more you see, the different you are and the different the religion is for you. Religion is, in the same way I'm talking about it, is also ahistorical in the sense which I talked about it before. History is open. It's terribly interesting in Judaism that, the Jews are probably the rabbinical tradition, I think, is really extremely clear on this issue. You can't solve a question. As soon as you settle an issue, you have to accept the fact that in the future someone's going to object to it. So the future is open. You can't come around from that end and close down the system. The system has an open-endedness that you don't know how to close, and you don't know what's going to keep it going. So you can't even predict what it's going to be like in another century or two. There is an ahistoricality is not the word I want. I guess the word I want is really historicality. It's genuinely history. It's really historical. One of the metaphors of historicality in this sense, of course, would be the path. There's always a way ahead, but you don't know exactly what's on it. A path, a way, a pilgrimage, a journey, a wandering. You know, one of the great images of medieval Christianity is the wandering monk who would, so-called peregrino, who would set off in a little boat or set off into the wilderness and just see what happened. So that's part of the vision of the historicality, of the sort of unendingness of the religion in which way, the way in which I'm talking about it. And then finally, this point, religion of this kind also has a sacred text. But the text is looked at very differently. Jesus certainly has a centrality to Christianity. We all accept that. Every Christian will, and non-Christian probably. But then the next question is, who is Jesus? I'm sure I'll just remind you of the fact I'm sure you're all aware of, that there are whole libraries of books on the nature of Jesus. The issue is wildly open. It's not closed. He is a peculiar, unidentifiable, unparaphrasable person. You cannot say what Jesus taught without being challenged in some way. And yet at the same time, there's a great desire on the part of many people to say what he taught. But the desire is not answerable. Aristotle very famously said, knowledge begins in wonder. Speaking religiously, I would say it also ends in wonder. So knowledge from a religious point of view takes us to wonder. We wonder what is going to happen. Okay, I'm sorry, just going a little long here. Okay, very quickly, elements of warfare. Whereas religion is a phenomenon of longevity, warfare is a phenomenon of brevity. One of the big issues in the Iraq War now is how to end it, bring it to an end. The Six-Day War in Israel is a mythic example of a war so effective it ended right away. So it's a boundary way of acting and thinking. it's very important in warfare to have a successful kind of veiling. Now, veiling is complicated in warfare. Number one, the enemy has to be veiled. We don't see the person over there as a person, as one of us, but one of them, nameless. The soldiers in Iraq referred to the prisoners they had in Abu Ghraib and other places, not as he and she, but as it. It is reducing the other to something different, unknown, and, as it were, really irrelevant. But also, the soldier has to be veiled himself. The soldier has to have ways of justifying to himself what he's doing. One of the great tragedies of war is what happens to people after they've done their soldiering. This is tragic when they realize what they've done as soldiers. But in the training of soldiers, this sort of self-veiling is absolutely essential. Otherwise, a war couldn't be fought. Instead of and wars, of course, also need opponents. Another thing that's strange about the war in Iraq is that it's very hard to figure out who the opponent is. The original reason for going to war is not the reason we're there anymore, and just who's opposing us is not clear. It changes all the time, and so therefore it's an unsuccessful war, kind of warfare. But I want to give a twist to that, and that is, when we have a desire for war, we also have a desire, or once we begin to mythologize the warrior, we also have a desire for an enemy. The enemy doesn't create an army, the army creates its enemies. Once we have an army, we begin to look for enemies. I could say more about that if the occasion comes up later. Now, you see the relation here between belief and warfare. Believing and warfare are both extremely bounded activities. But the main thing I want to say is that the warrior and the believer tend, over time, to take on each other's characteristics. So we have the soldier believer, and the soldier as saint. The believer is soldier, and the soldier as saint. We, for example, we monumentalize our soldiers in a genuinely religious way, or at least in the other way of thinking about religion. For example, take the Lincoln and Washington monuments. The Washington Monument is a great, like a divine finger, not only pointing upward, but a kind of warning finger. It has a powerfully religious character to it. There's a lot of other characters. You know, it's the phallic representation of the father of our country, and so on. And the Lincoln Memorial at the other end of the mall is a temple, and Lincoln is seated in it as a god, surrounded by the sacred text of his speaking. Warfare creates heroes. Heroes are the winners of battles, even if they die. As a matter of fact, heroes really have to die to be genuine heroes, to be remembered as heroes. And we have lots of ways of memorializing our heroes. We name airports after them and highways. And I noticed the other day that poor General MacArthur just gets a tunnel over here. I can't help telling you that coming out on the plane, I was looking for material to talk about the warrior as believer and believer as warrior and so on. I picked up the last volume of the Left Behind series of books. Now, I don't want you to think there's professional envy here. I wrote a fictional gospel, kind of my own version of Jesus, that sold 6,000 copies. And these folks have sold 60 million copies. I did the arithmetic. It's 100,000 books for every one of mine. So, there are a lot of people out there who are affected by it and whose beliefs are represented by it. And it's really remarkable stuff. I outlined and circled and wrote exclamation points all the way through it. I'll just share a couple of things with you. What happens, of course, is that there's a great warfare between the evil, sinful part of the world and the handful of believers, a remnant actually, of believers who take on vast millions of extremely well-prepared, excellent, disciplined soldiers. The soldiers, the enemy, the evil forces are called, interestingly, the global community. Now, if this in your mind means the United Nations, is quite possible. The head of the global community, the head soldier, is I'm sorry, I really don't mean to make fun of it that much, but it's hilarious. He dresses in he wears a chartreuse sleeveless shirt hung with medals and symbols, every one but the Christian symbol, and his great huge rings on his fingers. And I don't believe the authors, a guy named Tim LaHaye and somebody Jenkins, were conscious of the fact that they were describing a pimp. But I'm sure that was in their unconscious. Now, the global community, referred to in this battle as the GC, has its own television network. So when Jesus appears, at the end, of course, there's all kinds of lightning and raining of blood and so on. The television firm of the GC leaves all this out. And what's the name of this television system? It's the GCNN. I'm sorry, but in other words, the liberal press, the liberal media. It's such a vivid and, in a way, disturbing example of the way in which the religious person has become heroic. Jesus is now a hero. He appears on a white horse, white hair, surrounded by white armies of white. The leader of the GC is on a black horse in his chartreuse shirt. And Jesus comes to end everything. This is it. It's the final. It's the last moment. History's over. Now, I just have a second. I'll just take a second on this. The relationship of religion and war. I go back to the idea of poetry. The poet is more powerful, I believe, than the soldier. Plato in the Republic described the poet as a person who could deceive you, a person who represents reality as something it isn't. Plato actually recommended that poets do this to protect the integrity of the Republic. He recommended a kind of propaganda, a way of deceiving the public. What Plato didn't quite see is that he himself is a great poet. And so the whole thing is a work of poetry. Plato used the term poetes or poiesis, poiesis meaning poetry and poetes, the poet. But it means more than just poetry. It means a kind of creativity. He included everything. He even included cosmetics in it, and carpentry and architecture and building. These are the creators in our society. These people, as Plato saw it, are dangerous, but they're also the way out of the issue. Osama bin Laden, in his little cave, hidden somewhere, was able, by means of poetry, to get the United States to spend, I think, what is it now, $4 billion a month, or a week, yeah, on this war. All he did was make a few videos. Interesting, look at it another way. Osama is less dangerous, a lot of you might object to this, to the American people than our own drunk teenagers. Every 3 weeks, enough people die on the highways to create another 9/11. But we are fixed by Osama's poetic deception into thinking this is really the way our world should be structured. But the poets can do just something else. Osama is veiling us. He's a deceiver. Poets can also unveil us. The poet is able to go into a temple of Lincoln and ask, did we have to fight this terrible war? Didn't we rather have to deal with an illness in the mind that made vicious racial distinctions? Wasn't that the struggle? Rather than trying to keep the states together, a territorial and boundary event? Or Washington, was in fact the Revolutionary War necessary? He's our hero, but maybe he's also our fool. Canada, after all, never had a war of revolution. George III died, and the need for it was really gone. But the poet as deceiver puts that monument right in front of us. The poet as unveiler asks the deeper question. One of the most significant events of the 20th century, strangely rarely discussed, is the awesome fact that the Soviet Union came to an end without one death. The Russians got together and decided they were free to do it. We're no longer this nation. And it was over. We get up every day deciding to be San Francisco or to be a church or America or something. We can also get up in the morning and decide not to be. The poet offers that chance. And the poet in this sense is the deepest, most representative member of the religion I'm talking about, that kind of religion. So, can the poet save us? I wonder. Thank you.
Thank you. Is this on? We have some questions for you, if you don't mind. If you have the energy. This first one is from Sandeep. You raise your hand if you're, there you go. In your experience, from your research, have you come across a game where you play to let the other players win? If you have, would it still be a finite game? And if it's not, is it part of human nature to only win?
you know, it's a tricky business because sometimes letting someone win is a way of winning yourself. It establishes your own superiority in the play. Instead of, I would say a little bit differently that it's not a matter of letting someone win. It's a matter of keeping someone in the play, keeping the issue of winning and losing in a kind of poetic balance. It's a very good question, very hard to give a simple answer, but I'm always suspicious when I see people, you know, like you do with a kid who really wants to win badly. And so you play your cards in such a way that the kid wins. It's really kind of an arrogant thing to do, and isn't genuine play. It's a little bit on the trickery side. But I understand the feeling in the question. Sure, there are times when you don't want to play a game that just crushes somebody. You know, when the world heavyweight champ comes out and has to fight his grandmother, this is not a legitimate finite game.
Here's another question from Fabrice Florin. Can we find a cure for blind faith, or I would say maybe belief, in our lifetime? If so, what might that be?
You know, we really, really need poets. We do, really. We need people who can, who read a great deal, who think a great deal, who are able to get at the ways in which people veil themselves, and not be judgmental in a sense, but try to create a larger inclusive context. And you know, I don't know if we can do it. I was talking with Kevin this morning. I think he was a little shocked when I told him, I actually am a pessimist. I don't think we can overcome our contradictions. It doesn't mean I'm not going to try, but I have a feeling that in the end, it's the finite players that win out. And what that means is the finite players in the end will destroy their own civilization. Civilization will destroy itself. I think the indications are very strong in that direction. But the only way of preventing it is not an army. But let me briefly use the example of rabbinical Judaism. They had, for almost 2,000 years, since the destruction of the Second Temple, there was no army. There was no country that belonged to them. There was no single language. Even Hebrew died. They were widely dispersed. But the power of the rabbinical imagination kept the tradition alive. What we need are rabbis that can keep the deeper traditions of human culture and existence in play and at a profound level. Poets.
So maybe kind of a follow-up to that from RJ. You seem entirely perplexed. What allows you to sleep at night, and what gets you up in the morning?
My wife. Also, I love breakfast. You know, so. Yeah, I'm perplexed.
Isn't the, this is from Carlos Matzan, isn't the identity of religion simply the in-out group behavior of followers? For instance, the definition of a kosher food or observance of holidays?
I never met a Jew I would describe as a follower. My wife is Jewish. I have 3 Jewish children and 7 Jewish grandchildren. They don't follow me at all. I don't think they follow anybody. I think genuinely religious people are not followers, they're beginners. They're people who start things, who get it moving and keep it moving. A religious person is someone who hears. Well, let me turn that around a little bit. The genuine religious teacher, master, guru, rabbi, priest, is someone who in his or her ministration or teaching makes him or herself dispensable. A true teacher is one who disappears and leaves it all to the student. So that following has to be understood much more as beginning than following. A true teacher starts his student to do something and doesn't know where it's going.
This one is from Katrina Galway. Could you identify yourself? Okay.
Yeah.
Is the U.S. Constitution an example of a believer's text that ends discussion, or is it infinitely undetermined?
That's a great question. There's a kind of dogma among Supreme Court justices that goes like this. I don't have an ideology. I am committed strictly to understanding things in terms of the Constitution. And it's only a matter of law. It's not a matter of morality. It's not a matter of ideology. It's not a matter of philosophical or religious points of view. It's just law. But it's interesting, isn't it, that the people who say that have very often a very strong ideological bent to themselves. But what's even more interesting is that no matter how strong their ideology is, the Constitution in the end does them in. The Constitution is greater. I mean, the Constitution is a great text. It's something that seems to be interpretable easily, but in fact, in practice, it's something that renews its own originality over and over again. No matter who summarizes or how completely perfectly they summarize what the Constitution means, someone has another meaning. Just take the First Amendment. The literature on the First Amendment is enormous. I mean, there'd be tens of thousands of books written on the meaning of the First Amendment. It's a great, great document, the Constitution. We're very privileged to have it. It's a work of poetry, by the way. Not law, that's poetry.
So this one's from Paul King. There you go. Ken Wilber has said, violence is often ended by stronger violence in saner hands. For instance, the U.S. intervention in World War II or Yugoslavia. Do you think this is true, or is this just a rationalization? The great example, of course, that everyone talking about warfare has to deal with is the Second World War. I have no question whatsoever that it was all evil. I mean, that Hitler was evil and a lot of other people, Saddam and so on. Where I think the issue lies, though, is not dealing with an evil enemy, but dealing with the evil enemy, but at the same time acknowledging the evil in ourselves. Goethe said, interesting that he'd be a German saying this, he never heard of a crime he himself, he didn't think he could commit. I think what we have to do is recognize in ourselves the desire to do these things or the possibility of them, even as we eliminate them.
I'm quite convinced that all evil is itself the attempt to eliminate evil. And therefore, I mean, if you address, Hitler was convinced that he was wiping the earth clean of the most despicable evil people ever to appear in it. I mean, he was really clear on what the evil was. Can we be so clear about what the evil is? Yes and no. We have to keep the shadow, the deep shading in our question. Go to war, yes, but go to war with a deep feeling of guilt that we have to do this.
This is a question from Pam Strayer. There in the back.
Yeah, hi, Pam.
Why do you think people need certainty? That is, believers need certainty. What is it that makes complexity and uncertainty so difficult to handle?
Yeah, I like that question because I don't have an answer. This is another form of my perplexity here. You know, I tend to get psychoanalytic and existential on that issue. And what I mean by that is this. When someone realizes, let me tell you a story. I have a friend. I had a friend, he's now dead, I'm very sorry to say. Great loss. A very close friend. Who was a hero for me as a kid. He was a great athlete. He was an All-American. He was amazing, beautiful. He was funny, smart. He became a Navy SEAL and had a remarkable military career. And then when he got out of the Navy, he started a series of businesses that didn't really quite succeed. And finally, he got one going. But the business depended on a certain manufacturing company in Michigan, as it happened. The owner of that company saw what this guy had as a possibility and gave the whole manufacturing process over to his brother, the owner of this factory. And overnight, my friend's business was gone, just like that. And he had to move his children and give up all. It was a great anguish in his life. Some years after that, I was on the phone with him, and it turned out that we were both traveling somewhere, and we were crossing paths in Cleveland. And both our planes were there at the same time, landing there. And so we made a deal to meet in a bar in the terminal in Cleveland, some bar. He knew where it was. He knew where all the bars were. So anyway, we met in the bar. And he came up to me. He was a little bit late. He said, "You'll never believe whom I just saw." I was trying to think, there's got to be something important. He saw that guy that gave the business to his brother. And I had this thrill, really. It was kind of exciting, thinking, if I were a Navy SEAL, what would I do to this guy? So it was a great moment. I said, "Well, what did you do?" And he said, I bought him a beer. I said, "You what? What?" And he put his hand on my shoulder and he said, "Hey, it's only business."